Hi guys. So in this segment we're going to talk about Kingdom Protista, which we've seen is such a mixed up polyphyletic mess. And we're going to focus a little bit on their ecology before we jump into the phylogenetics and diversity of these organisms. So we know that protists have a huge amount of structural and functional diversity as well as DNA and molecular diversity. So we're going to look at some of the nutritionally diverse types of protists, including some of our photoautotrophs, often called algae or phytoplankton. We'll talk about some of the heterotrophs who can be predators or decomposers. We'll look briefly at some mixotrophs, which are able to do both photosynthesis and are heterotrophic. Okay? And then we'll also talk about how these organisms can interact with other organisms in their ecosystem. So ideas like mutualistic relationships, as well as we'll look at some examples of parasites. Okay, so again, we're going to focus on ecology in this segment, and we'll talk more about phylogenetics later. Okay. So again, protists are often producers. This means that they are autotrophic and able to take energy from light and turn it into sugars. Consumers are the organisms that must eat other organisms or organic matter and able to get their nutrients and their energy. These organisms can be predators, decomposers, and because of their roles, these organisms, the protists, actually play heavily into ideas like nutrient cycling, particularly carbon, but other nutrients as well. Okay, we'll look at some mutualistic relationships and then some parasites as well. So photoautotrophic protists include algae and phytoplankton. So many of these guys are single-celled organisms that live on their own. Others are colonial, like volvox down here. And this green one is volvox. Some are actually multicellular, and we'll talk about those macroalgae in a minute. Okay, there are a few that are mixotrophs as well. So the euglenoids, like Euglena, is actually able to photosynthesize. It has chloroplasts, so we can see that in the diagram here. And they also have a little feeding groove where they take in food and ingest nutrients as well. Okay, these algae and phytoplankton are considered the bottom of the food chain. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that many organisms eat them. So when these diatoms and dinoflagellates and other phytoplankton bloom and increase their numbers, often exponentially, there are so many of them that we can actually see these algal blooms from space. So this image here is actually from Lake Erie last year in 2019, and we can see this huge amount of algae blooming in the lake. Okay, these phytoplankton are the bottom of the food chain, which means many organisms eat them. Okay, so zooplankton often eat them, so do fish and their larvae. Sometimes small fish will eat the plankton as well. But there's also this food chain where energy is passed along. Okay, humans are not exempt from this. There are many types of algae that we eat. For example, if you like sushi, nori is a type of red algae that's often used to prepare sushi and make sushi rolls. Okay, those macroalgae, these are often the multicellular large algae, generally what you think of when we say seaweed. And seaweed usually is either a brown algae, red algae, or green algae. And we can see that these are in different clades. Again, we'll talk more about the phylogenetics later. So these algae can be very large. Again, they're often eaten by other organisms. So this is one of my favorites. It's called ulva or sea lettuce, and it's a favorite of organisms like manatees, which are known as sea cows. So I think it's kind of funny that sea cows munch on sea lettuce. Okay. Some macroalgae like kelp, which is a brown algae, have a lot in common with organisms like plants. So they have these leaf-like blades, a stem-like stalk, and then a holdfast that looks a lot like roots. Okay, this is an example of convergent evolution. These traits did not evolve from one ancestor. Okay, but because of these similarities in structure, we also see similarities in function. So kelp can actually grow to be humongous, and they make these humongous tall columns underwater. And we see kelp forests forming off the coasts, including off the coast of California and the East Coast. These kelp forests, just like a forest of trees, provide huge amounts of habitat for other organisms. So many fish and mammals and other things will live here. Many will also use it as a nursery, so they come in and lay their eggs and give their young a safe place to grow. Okay, so these heterotrophic protists are also important in their ecosystem. They eat other organisms. So many of them are predators, like the algae or the amoebas, sorry. So there are several amoebas down here at the bottom, and we can see this one using its pseudopodia to engulf this bacterium, and it will eat that. Okay, others are filter feeders. So this little guy is a ciliate. It's using this crown of cilia to actually create a water current and suck in all these particles that it has eaten. And so these are important for helping keep waterways clean and to help keep the ecosystem balanced. So I mentioned that protists are important in nutrient cycles and as decomposers. So phytoplankton are a big one with the carbon cycle because they help absorb CO2 out of the water and the atmosphere and turn that into sugars. And then those sugars are passed up the food chain. And like any other eukaryote, they also tend to do a lot of cellular respiration, so returning a lot of that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, keeping it nice and balanced. Other organisms, like this lovely slime mold, this one in particular is a dog vomit slime mold, and they're important for cycling all kinds of nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. They eat and use dead and decaying materials, and waste materials, and help cycle the nutrients back into the soil and break things down faster than it would without them. So protists are also involved in many symbiotic relationships where they live closely with their counterparts, often in an obligate fashion, where if one is removed, both will die. And so one example of this is with coral. So if you guys didn't know, coral are actually an animal. Here's a coral polyp. They're kind of like a jellyfish or a sea anemone, and we'll see later in the semester that these are actually related. And they live in these colonies on these shell-like structures that they build out of calcium carbonate. Okay? And they are hugely diverse, multicolored organisms that create a rainforest-esque habitat in warm, shallow waters. Okay? Fun fact, these coral rely heavily upon dinoflagellates that live inside of their little bodies. Okay? The dinoflagellates, as a phytoplankton, are able to produce sugars, which they will share with the coral. Okay, so the coral gets a lot of its nutrients from these little symbiotes. In exchange, the dinoflagellates have a nice, safe place to live, and they're protected from the harsh outer environments. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the phenomena called coral bleaching. Okay, when coral, these little animals, get stressed out due to pollution or other problems, they will actually expel their little dinoflagellates. Okay, eventually both of these guys will die. Those dinoflagellates are exposed and other things eat them, and then the corals can't get enough energy and enough nutrients, so they also die. This leaves behind these coral shells that look bleached and white. So this is not where people are dumping bleach in the ocean, but it's a bleached out shell with no life left on it. And last I read, we actually have lost something like 80% of our coral reefs to this process of bleaching because corals are getting so stressed out due to climate change and pollution. Okay. Another place we see symbiotic protists is in the guts of termites. So termites use both bacteria and protists that are able to break down wood, particularly the compound lignin in wood. Okay, and that allows them to get extra nutrients out of a substance that most animals can't eat. And the third symbiotic relationship we're going to touch on are the lichens. So this is where we have an algae and a fungi living together. Okay, this symbiosis is so successful that these guys are often colonizers. They move into brand new ecosystems where there's bare rock, and they are able to actually start growing on that rock and preparing that ecosystem for other organisms to come in. So if we look at this under a microscope, we actually see the algal cells embedded within the fungus, and all these little hyphae strings are part of the fungus. And again, algae are able to photosynthesize, and they share nutrients with the fungus. And in exchange, those algae are getting nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and a safe place to live from that fungus. Okay, the last big idea we're going to talk about in this segment is that protists are parasites. So we've already seen in lab that many of these organisms, like Trypanosoma here, can actually affect humans, but there are also diseases that affect animals and plants. So parasitic protists are often pathogens. Things like Giardia actually cause severe diarrhea, and they get into the intestinal tract and cause all kinds of gastrointestinal issues. This one is also prone to attacking canines. So you guys may have experienced it if you've ever kenneled your dog or gotten a dog from a shelter. Sometimes they pick up this very contagious parasite, Giardia, and it causes a lot of problems if it's not treated. And Trichomonas is another example. This one can cause yeast infections in humans. And again, it's kind of similar to this guy. It's another protist that gets into our body. And Trypanosoma is a whole genus of problems. So these little guys can cause diseases like African sleeping sickness or Chagas disease. And Chagas disease is actually started in South America and has made its way into the United States, mostly in places like Florida. Both of these are transferred by insects. Okay? Those insects kind of regurgitate some of these protists into the bloodstream, and these single-celled organisms then use our bloodstream and our bodies to reproduce and cause all kinds of nasty side effects and even death if not treated. Okay? An even more deadly blood-borne disease is Plasmodium. This is the one that causes malaria. It's one of the top killers in the world. I think it is the #1 protist disease in the world. And these are older numbers, but it kills approximately 600,000 people each year. So this is a very big problem, especially in places like Africa and other tropical areas where mosquitoes are a large problem. And mosquitoes help transfer this disease. The protist travels with the mosquito and gets injected into our bloodstream. It then uses our liver and blood cells to reproduce. So you guys don't need to know this life cycle. Just know that Plasmodium is an apicomplexan, the type of protist that causes some pretty nasty disease. And last one we're going to talk about for humans is Entamoeba histolotica. So this one causes amoebic dysentery, which is actually the third leading cause of human deaths caused by eukaryotic parasites or protists. This one is particularly nasty because it can form cysts. That means that it can go dormant and hide out and wait for the proper conditions. So this one will often lie dormant in waterways, and then when we ingest it, it will come to life and become active again and start making us quite sick. So these protists are not just a human problem either. Sudden oak death is a nasty protist disease that kills trees, particularly oak trees. The potato blight was caused by a protist that got into potatoes and killed almost all of them, mostly because those potatoes were genetically identical, but that's another story. Okay, and there are others that attack organisms like fish. So if you have fish tanks or a pond with fish in it, these might cause fish kills as well. Okay, so this segment we covered some of the ecology of protists. Thanks for watching.